Hey everyone, welcome to Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I'm Tim Durling. Thank everybody for watching, and thanks everybody for watching this episode. A lot of fun, and I'm very, very pleased to have my guest here. He's a stand-up comic, but he's also an author, and he has written a really cool book about a really interesting subject, particularly if you are, like me, a Deep Purple fan. We've got Mr. Steve McLean here, author of Stealing Deep Purple. And this book is about, it's subtitled The Unbelievably True Story of the Most Audacious Stunt in Rock and Roll. And this is about something some of you may have heard about, the Fake Purple Tour of 1980. So first of all, we'll get into, aspects of that. But first of all, Steve, I want to welcome you to the show.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
So Steve, I mean, you're a stand-up comic and now you're an author, or how does one, which came first? Talk me through this
Um,
process.
so in a previous life, I used to be a documentary development producer. So if you want to make a documentary, rather than spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on it to begin with, you spend a few $1,000s, and I will go out and I'll find out where the story is. I'll see where the footage is, and I'll find different story angles. And then at the same time as doing that, I was a bit of a small time music journalist as well. So I've reviewed records and live shows for people like Record Collector and Sky Arts Online and people like that. And then 2013, I had a radio show, and that kind of led me into becoming a stand up comedian. Um, and Yeah, so it's been like a kind of they've all kind of overlapped with each other because I do comedy about things that I love. My latest show is called Aerosmith to ZZ Top, the A to Z of hair metal, and I took that at the Edinburgh Fringe this year, and I'm touring it around. And so I don't like to. People can tell if you're a fraud, and I don't like to not write about things that I love. So, I've written about Star Wars, and I've written about Transformers, and I've written about hard rock, because otherwise, what's the point in saying something if you're not saying something about what you know about, you know?
Yeah, and right there, it sounds like we'd have gotten along fine back in the 80s. Star Wars, Transformers, and hard rock, man. There's a trip through the 80s for me.
It's a Venn diagram of one circle.
Yeah, yeah. So Steve, I mean, before we get into the nitty-gritty of this,
Mhm.
were you a Deep Purple fan to begin with?
I was probably what you call a greatest hits fan. Because I was a teenager in the '80s, so it was a reunion Deep Purple, and so I was probably more of a White Snake fan than I was a Deep Purple fan.
Same.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and then kind of moving back
yeah.
because I wasn't a teenager in the '70s. So obviously, Smoke on the Water and Black Knight and Highway Star. You knew these songs because they got played in the rock club. So I'm probably a greatest hits fan, and then um, I, I became moving backwards as I got older because, like in Coverdale, I found that I loved the Mark III lineup and the Mark IV lineup. Come Taste the
Hmm.
Band is
Oh
probably
yeah,
my favorite album of
it's
Deep
great.
Purple.
Yeah.
I mean, Getting Tighter, what a great tune. So yeah, I'm probably a greatest hits fan, and then a few other little, deep cuts.
That sounds very much like my sort of journey with Deep Purple because yeah, I mean I got into music really heavily 86, 87. Bon
Mm,
Jovi Slippery When Wet
yeah,
was the
yeah,
album that did it
yeah,
for me. Def Leppard Hysteria, and not very long after
yeah,
that was the
yeah,
Whitesnake 87 album. But
yeah.
like any group, I get into a group and I needed to go back. So I got, the second thing I bought after I bought the 87 album was Live in the Heart of the City, which is still one of my
Right.
favorite
Yes,
live
yes,
albums of
yes,
all time.
yes. Yeah, yeah.
But it wasn't until, and I was aware of Deep Purple, obviously, and I knew that Coverdale was in like sort of a latter day incarnation of Deep
Hmm.
Purple before they went on hiatus. But I didn't explore any further until about 92. I started in 92, I got way into a lot of 70s bands. I got way into
Mm.
Queen and I got way into Kansas. I'm so much into
Yeah.
Kansas that I wrote a book about them. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, yeah. Zeppelin and Leonard
Mm.
Skinner and Nazareth and Deep Purple. Now, Deep Purple
Mm.
was the sort of a natural one for me because of the Whitesnake connection. And I'm also a very big fan of, I mean, I like the commercial side of things. So I really like the Joe Lynn Turner Rainbow stuff.
Right.
So
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
so I'm a big fan of Straight Between the Eyes and Bend Out of
Right.
Shape. And
yeah.
So, and when I first started listening to Purple, some of the stuff sounded, to my younger ears, sounded really dated to me, but eventually it grew on me, and I learned to appreciate it in
Mm,
context of what they were doing when they were doing it. I mean, In Rock is 55 years old, and it is a fresh sounding album.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, and so to bring this sort of full circle, the first time that I had some inkling that there was this faux, FAOX, uh, FAUX purple happening.
Hmm.
And I owe this guy an apology because I very quietly I didn't believe him, but let me explain. I had a former colleague that he knew I was way into music, and so we were just making conversation, and he talked about so I'm in Eastern Canada, so I'm in the province of New
Hmm.
Brunswick. I'm right on the border of the state of Maine. So he talked about going to see Deep Purple in Edmundston, New Brunswick, which is probably 2.5 hours away from where
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sitting here right now. I mean, that's Edmund. And he said he went to see them in the early 80s. He didn't give a specific year. So I'm such a music nerd, but the proof is that you can never know everything. But as soon as he started to say that, the alarm bells started going off in my head that there was no Deep Purple in the early
Yeah,
80s.
yeah,
What are you talking about?
yeah,
You're full of crap.
yeah.
Not, and I didn't say that. I'm listening, uh-huh.
No.
And he talked about them being really bad and nobody recognized the songs and, a familiar story. So I got thinking, "Oh, this doesn't make any sense. Was it a cover band?" And then I got thinking, maybe it was Rainbow, although I can't see Rainbow playing in it. I can't see Rainbow or Whitesnake or Gillan or any of those bands playing in Edmundston of all places. You
Mm.
know what I mean? So, but it stuck. So later on, as the years went on, I started hearing more about this band that was calling themselves Deep Purple, that their original singer Rod Evans was behind. And so I thought, well, maybe there is something to this. And sure enough, one of the chapters of your book, you talk about them playing in Edmundston, New Brunswick. So I'm
Yes.
like, well, I guess I owe him an apology.
Well,
So he,
also as well, can I say, almost exact same thing happened to me.
yeah,
I was 17 years old. It was 1992, 93, and I came down to London to watch Aerosmith. And it was me and a guy who I used to know, and he was much older. So he was a big Deep Purple head. He was loved Deep Purple. And we came to London to see Aerosmith. And we're in a bar called the Royal George, which used to be a really big rock club. And there was this guy in there, and he was saying how he saw Deep Purple in Boston in 1980. And my friend, who was a very big Purple head, said, "You're talking shit, mate. There was no Deep
yeah,
Purple in 1980."
there's no
And
such
these two
thing.
nearly came to blows. And then it was later I heard little bits of the story, because it's all over the place. There's no, it is, no one's really spoken about it properly at length since the time it happened. And in 1993, it was very hard to get old information. We were relying entirely on what was reprinted in magazines. So yeah, I slowly began to piece this kind of story together. But it became apparent actually as I researched this book, the shows that he said he went to in either Boston or Massachusetts. I think he went to one in Lowell, or might not have happened. So he might have been talking shit, but he also might have been talking truthful rubbish. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean? It's
yeah.
kind of, I think what's happened is he's seen the poster for the gig before it was cancelled, and then he's come and given it a load of to some young kids saying, "Oh, I saw Deep Purple," but in actual fact, he didn't realize he was talking rubbish. He thought he was talking the truth. So yeah, very similar kind of situation. The
Yeah.
story filtered through.
Yeah, it was really funny because I mean, in this case, it was so specific because I know he said Edmundston, and
Yeah.
I'm like, no big bands ever play Edmundston. That's not
And he
not
was right,
now,
and you were
not
right.
not now, not ever, right? And yeah, I mean, I learned over the years to be very wary of you just kind of listening. You be polite, and but in your side, like
Hmm.
this is not accurate. But memory is a funny thing, and but the fact that there's something very telling about the fact that this story that you're telling, where he's talking about a gig that didn't happen, but he swears he was there. That
Yeah.
is a recurring theme throughout the book.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
this dichotomy of it happened, it didn't happen, it was
Hmm.
advertised, it wasn't advertised. They
Yeah.
called themselves this, it wasn't called that.
Yeah.
So for those that don't know, and I do not want to give away any spoilers because I highly recommend you get Steve's book. But what happened in 1980 is that Rod Evans, who was the original lead singer for Deep Purple. He sang on the first three Deep Purple albums, Shades of Deep Purple, Book of Taliesin, and the self-titled 68, 69. So he sang on Hush, which was a huge hit for them.
Massive hit,
Yeah,
massive hit.
top five single in Canada and the
Yep,
U.S. Um, Kentucky Woman was a top 40 single for
yep.
them. You've seen those albums a million times in a million different configurations because nobody seems to know who holds the rights to them. But the fact of the matter is that Rod Evans was a legitimate member of Deep
Hmm.
Purple. And as people know, big fans know, Deep Purple had been dormant since 1976 when the Mark IV lineup, as you said, um, kind of sputtered to a close. I mean,
Mm.
I think I agree with you. I think "Come Taste the Band" is an incredible record, but that tour, Tommy Bolin was not in good shape, and Glenn Hughes wasn't in good shape, so it kind of sputtered to a close. So as we know, they all kind of split off in different directions. So you had, uh, Richie Blackmore had already left and formed Rainbow, and at a certain point, Roger Glover found himself in Rainbow. David Coverdale split, did a solo career. Eventually, he ended up with John Lord and Ian Pace
Hmm.
in his band, and that would have been the case in 1980. And when I say Whitesnake, I have to make sure that people in North America understand Whitesnake was not an entity was not a going concern in North America in 1980. So
Yeah,
when you say
yeah.
Whitesnake, they were huge. Not at this time. Not in North America.
They were
Um,
struggling.
they did well in the UK and
Hmm.
probably Japan and other in parts of Europe, but they were kind of a non-issue. The albums were out there. Fool for Your Lovin' was a minor hit, but we're not talking about a. This is not the Whitesnake of Here I Go Again and
Yeah.
Still of the Night. So so you had Rainbow, which also was never that big in North America, and they went through a million lineup changes, and even less so was Gillan. I mean, started out the Ian Gillan band, then he formed
Mm.
just Gillan. They never had any chart success that I know of in North
No,
America. I mean,
I couldn't.
Rainbow and Whitesnake charted, and Rainbow had Stone Cold, which is a top 40 single, and but the point of the fact is that
Mm.
there was no entity. Their Deep Purple was just that. It was an entity. It was not a group of guys at this
Yeah.
point. So again, the origins are murky, how it all happened, but you ended up with Rod Evans, who is depicted here in the middle with short haircut, and four other musicians who are pretty much unknown decided to call themselves Deep Purple. Now, an important addendum to this is that this had already happened with Steppenwolf, right?
So this had happened with lots of bands, but
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
it happened with there's lots of fake versions in existence. There's not. I mean, you talk about the bands that kind of you talk about Whitesnake not being the Whitesnake we know now. In 1974, there was a fake Fleetwood Mac kicking
yes,
around
that's right.
for
Yeah,
about 3 or 4 months, and that was possible because they weren't the Fleetwood Mac of huge proportions. They were just before the Fleetwood Mac, so you were able to stick five random guys out on the road, and the majority of the audience wouldn't know what Fleetwood Mac was supposed to look like. Same with Steppenwolf. So Steppenwolf is a slightly different scenario because what a lot of people forget was so that there might have been there's talk that at any one time there was up to five versions of Steppenwolf going around the US and Canada and Mexico, and they all had different lineups, and maybe three of them had an original member, and one of them had a member who joined afterwards. So, but what people forget about that story or often overlook is that John Kay did, in fact, license the name to three people who were not in Steppenwolf. He did like while they then went on to abuse the name. The original idea of the spin-off of Steppenwolf and the Steppenwolf run by Goldie McJohn and Nicholas and Kent Henry, that was a official Steppenwolf that gets lost in the fake Steppenwolves that are kicking around at the time. Now they all went on and abused the name, perhaps you could say it like that, where they all went on and had their own versions of Steppenwolf. But certainly John Kay definitely opened the door to allow that to happen. Now, two of those guys who were in one of the fake Steppenwolf, in fact, three of them, Dick Jurgens, Tony Flynn, and Jeff Emery, all then went on to be in the fake Deep Purple. Interestingly, the fake Steppenwolfs, one of the fake Steppenwolves had Steve Riley in it, who'd end up in the LA Guns.
That's right. Yeah, I was surprised to read that. Yeah, he was in LA Guns. He was in Wasp. He was in
Yeah,
Keel. Yeah.
what a great. I mean, I know he passed. Did he pass away last year? Sorry,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
what a great CV he has.
Yeah.
What a what a wonderful, what a wonderful CV. You look at all of the great bands I was in.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's so I think what happened was with the fake Steppenwolf is these two guys. Jeff Emery certainly was a lawyer. It was a graduate attorney, and they saw what happened. The promoter called Steve Green with a fake Steppenwolf basically brought, by putting out the fake Steppenwolf, brought John Kay to the table. And I think what happened was Jeff Emery thought, I could do that with Deep Purple. Now, there's a lot of talk that Steve Green was also involved in the fake Deep Purple. However, I can find absolutely no paperwork and no paper trail to say that he is. I'm not saying he wasn't. And there's a lot of people, and certainly when you post this video in the comment section, there will be at least half a dozen people going, Steve Green was definitely involved. They can't point you to where they saw that, but they will definitely be 100%
The
sure he
myth,
was.
the myth
Yes.
is grown.
And I'm
Yeah.
not saying he wasn't. I'm just
But you
saying there's
you can't
no,
find anything that links him
no.
directly. Yeah.
And being that he was happy to be linked to the fake Steppenwolf, and he was happy to be linked to the fake Iron Butterflies, or licensed. Let's not say fake. Let's say licensed Steppenwolves and licensed Iron Butterflies. It seems quite unusual that he would then that he would then not link himself to this, especially as they were operating from a position that they were legally correct to begin with.
Yeah.
So yes, so the fake Steppenwolf is almost like 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 a pre-credit sequence in the film. So the fake Steppenwolf sets up the film as,
Yeah.
this is the pre-credit sequence. We've got away with this before. Let's do it again.
Almost like if you had a movie trilogy, this would start off the second part and give
Yes,
you a little
yes,
bit of background to, you
yes.
know, here's how Gollum found the ring.
Exactly. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. It would
Yeah.
exactly be like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
it would be.
So it's really interesting because I mean I know that this has happened. This goes back to the 50s where you have bands like the Platters and
Mhm,
who nobody really knew who was in these groups anyway. But when
mm.
you get to 1980, we're sort of in a more modern age, or at least I was alive then, right? And then you're dealing with a band that means something in terms of hard rock, heavy metal, and is greatly admired. And in 1980 in the UK, you had the new wave of British heavy metal
Mhm,
happening, and you had all sorts of bands that were obviously influenced by Deep Purple. I've said this many times. Any rock band who wanted to claim legitimacy by having a keyboard player owes a big debt to John Lord and Deep
oh
Purple.
yeah,
They
yeah,
they just they just made that all possible.
they
Um,
did.
but there's so many fascinating things about it, and people have to realize, like, even as more recently as 1993, like you're telling me, you hear the story in a bar about this guy going to see Deep
Hmm.
Purple in 1980 in Boston. You're like, that doesn't make any sense, but
Mm.
you can't just go on the internet and find out. And
No,
even
no.
today, there's so much conflicting information on the
Hmm.
internet, but you had no resources to look up old ads, nothing that was printed in Sounds or
Yeah,
Kerrang or
yeah.
North American
Unless you own the
magazines,
issues. Unless you
unless
own
you
the issues.
happen to own the issues.
Hmm.
And then it's like, if you don't have it on you, you don't have it in front of you to show somebody
Hmm.
who's arguing with you and go, look, it says right here.
Yep.
Um, and then of course people are adamant, I know what I saw. You've got that going on too. But people need to realize that, especially back in 1980, if you're thinking, how is it possible for five different bands to be touring in North America with the same
Mm.
name? News traveled slow.
And
And
also as well, the states. There's no real. It's not like Britain. People confuse the United States with other countries. They don't realize it's huge, and it's essentially 50 small countries.
yeah,
So there's very little outside of the national television networks, which don't really give a toss about who's playing in your local area. There's
right.
very little mass news media for the
Yeah.
whole country. So every single tiny state, or every single big state, which is essentially a tiny country, has its own news media, but it doesn't. The news doesn't leave the state for a couple of days. place, you
Yeah.
know. And it was very easy to rock up and say Deep Purple are coming, put a poster up locally, the tickets sell out locally, that band turn up, they're not the Deep Purple everyone's expecting, and then they leave town, and that information dies the minute they leave town.
Yeah. The only way that it would, or either it filters through very, very, very slowly, but
Slowly.
only when, as the book discusses, there becomes a pattern of
Yes,
shows
yes,
that are,
yes,
let's just say, played to mixed reactions.
yes,
Um,
yes.
and yeah, unless you happen to have, and this is a case of this, someone saw them at one of
Hmm.
these shows that happened to be visiting,
Hmm.
they go back to wherever it is they're from,
Yeah,
and in one case, happen to catch them on a good night,
yeah.
or supposedly a good night. So yeah, it's, I mean, nowadays, when you look at it now, there are all kinds of groups that are touring without any original members. Leonard Skinner comes to mind.
Hmm.
That, of course, is completely legitimate. You've got a Van Zant in the band, and obviously, the name is signed off on.
Hmm.
Molly Hatchet, another Southern rock example.
Hmm.
And Deep Purple itself, Ian Pace is the only original member that's still in
Yeah,
the group.
yeah.
But it's all about legalities, and it's all about really, really things that are boring to the average music fan. But when you see someone or an ad for something that says band name featuring such and such's band
Mm,
name, that's not by accident. It's has to say that legally
yeah,
if
yeah.
it's not,
There
just the full
usually
on band.
is. What I've found out is there usually is a licensing agreement. So even though, but a lot of fans were happy to get annoyed at Mike Love for touring with the Beach Boys name and him and Bruce Johnson.
Yeah,
However, what they were also ignoring was that Al Jardine and Brian and the relatives of Carl and Dennis signed off on it. They were
right.
like, okay, you can license the name. So it's like, if you're going to get cross at Mike Love for doing that, then surely you've got to get cross at the family for allowing that. You know, it's
Right.
that kind of thing. And so I mean, these days I think we're just glad we've got any version of the Beach Boys. But the point being, in the 90s when it first happened, the fans were up in arms, and it's like, well, hang on, they've said it's okay. Everyone's okay with it,
Yeah.
you know. So
That's
and
the part that's the fine print.
it ggets ignored. And
Yeah.
also, I tell you what, right? I mean, you know how? So before we were talking, uh, uh, we're talking about the slowness and the movement of the story. So this is, and you were mentioning about hard rock and how it was things that people cared about. This is actually a story in the same way. If you ever saw Searching for Sugar Man, you realized it was not just a story about Rodriguez, but it was a story about the birth of the internet. And this is a story about the music industry coming to terms very late on that pop music, be it rock music, be it heavy metal, it's popular music at some point, that pop music and rock music meant something to adults. And they were very, very slow to realize that. For years, they just catered. The reason why the fake zombies got away with it was because it was teenagers and no one really cared about upsetting teenagers. The reason why the fake Steppenwolf got away with it is because they were doing greatest hits and there weren't any real hardcore Steppenwolf fans around at that time. They'd kind of all tailed off. So the reason why they didn't get away with the fake Deep Purple or the bogus Deep Purple or the new Deep Purple, whatever you want to call them, is because the industry because the people had started to vocalize how they cared about rock music and how it meant to them in their late 20s, 30s, and early 40s. Suddenly, adults started saying, this is ours now. And so the industry had to pivot because the industry didn't care. And
Right.
all of the people, all the promoters that were saying, oh, we didn't know what we're booking. I will say 99% of them knew who they were booking. They didn't care who they were booking.
Right.
And it was only when it became apparent that the fans cared that the promoters started going, oh, nothing to do with me. I was con. And there's a guy in Anchorage who actually on the record saying, I knew exactly who I was booking.
Yes.
I went to see them. They put on a good show, you know, and it's this is the story that's within the story is the evolution of the music industry, realizing that people like me and you, or our contemporaries in 1980, 45-year-old, 50-year-old guys, gave a toss, gave a shit about this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's when it kind of started becoming an issue.
Yeah. You get the feeling that, I mean, we're 1980, we're only a year away from the advent of MTV.
Yeah.
So, something else that made this sort of thing possible is that people didn't necessarily know what Deep Purple looked like. They
Yep.
just saw a
Yep.
bunch of long-haired guys with hair obscuring their
Hmm.
faces. Okay, they've cut their hair now. Um, but in a couple of years with MTV, you knew exactly what these people were
Yeah.
supposed to look
Yeah.
like. And I get the feeling that they couldn't have done this a couple of years later or 3 or 4 years
So
later. Like this is like the last they got. I know MTV wasn't in everybody's houses
yeah.
in the United States by 1981. That's just when it went on the air in New York. But it was becoming more. It would have been that much harder for them to pull this off if they happened to
Yeah.
play in Lowell, Massachusetts. Well, guess what? MTV's on the air and they played an old clip of Smoke on the Water. It's like I don't. None of those guys look even remotely the
Yeah.
same in the
Yeah.
face. Like
It's a strange one because yes, MTV came and they actually provided the mass media of which for music. Because I mean, in the UK we had the NME, we had Sound, and everyone read it. We had Melody Maker, whereas there was localized music and entertainment magazines as well over there. But MTV came along and gave a uniformed. They gave everyone the same thing and the same information and the same news. I guess as well it's this kind of thing was still happening into the 80s with bands that there was some. So the promoter we're talking about, Steve Green, who may or may not have been involved, he did an interview with someone and he was talking about what was called a soft seater. So they were targeting things like village fates or tractor pools and county fairs and things like that, where people wouldn't necessarily, they just wanted the name and the hits. They didn't really care what they looked like, and you could still get away with that as late as the late 90s as long as you had the right name. Now there was a fake Frankie Goes to Hollywood in 1998 into 2003, and they got away with it mainly because in the States Frankie Goes to Hollywood maybe had one hit, maybe two. Was Relax a
Relax.
hit
That
over?
was
Right.
it.
Okay,
Relax was
so
a
we
big hit, but that was about
yeah,
it.
so no one really knew what they looked like. So these guys from Alabama basically trademarked Frankie Goes to Hollywood's name and went out as saying the new Frankie Goes to Hollywood.
You got a
So
guy with short hair and sunglasses. That's
yeah,
Frankie Goes to Hollywood, right?
yeah, exactly. So it depends on. I think Deep Purple were always too big to do it with over a long period of time. Don't you know? I mean, don't lock horns with someone that big who have money and don't need the money. But there were certainly fake versions of bands into the 80s, but bands that no one really cared about because people cared about Deep Purple. So there's a fake Box Tops in the 80s. There were lots of fake versions of 50s bands kicking around.
Yeah.
There's a fake Blues Image. There was, but that were coming and playing fairs, and everyone went, "Oh, I saw Blues Image," and Blues Image fans, of which there would have been maybe a dozen out of 500 people, said, "No, you didn't." So I think it's yes, MTV would have put a stop to anyone doing it with a name that big, but also the name was too big to do it with. I think that was the flaw than the
Yeah.
plan.
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing's fascinating to me. I mean, even, you mentioned the Beach Boys. Just a slightly younger example would be
Mm-hmm.
Journey. For anybody that would be like, I can't believe that Neil Sean and Jonathan Cain are touring without Steve Perry. Guess what? Journey do a show, Steve Perry gets paid.
Yep,
That's
yep,
their agreement. In order for them to go forward with, well, as it turns
yep,
out, 3 or 4 singers, they had Steve Perry's blessing, but he gets a cut out of it. So
yep,
it's not a matter of nobody's in the business, nobody's pulling the wool over anybody's
yeah,
eyes.
yeah. It's just in
And
the public.
yeah, and I mean, it wasn't that long ago, 6, 7 years ago, there were two versions of Yes out on the road. So
There was,
you had
yeah, there was one, yeah.
You had John Anderson, Trevor Rabin, and Rick Wakeman touring
Uh,
as Yes, featuring Anderson Wake
yeah,
was Anderson Rabin Wakeman. They had
yeah,
to call themselves that, and then you had Steve Howe's Yes,
yeah.
and then there's different versions of Asia, but obviously there are agreements, and it's very specific that you name it the way that you do.
So have you heard of a British band called UB40?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so there's two versions of UB40. There's UB40 featuring Ali Campbell, and there's UB40. Now, Ali Campbell's the original singer,
Yeah.
and then the rest of the band that haven't left the tour is UB40. Now, um, someone said to me, "So why don't they just put their differences aside?" And one of the reasons why they don't put their differences aside is they would all suddenly have to earn a lot less money, because Ali Campbell rejoining UB40 would mean, so that, say there's five core members and then there's the auxiliary members. The five
Hmm.
core members will get a five-way split on the money, and they will pay the auxiliary members a weekly salary. If you had Ali Campbell join, he would now have to have a six-way split on the money. So rather
Hmm.
than having 100% of the core member money in Ali Campbell featuring UB40 featuring Ali Campbell, he would then have to take 1/6. And UB40 are not a big enough band that the merger between the two would create a double ticket fee, or a double
Right.
fee for
Yeah.
them. So it just makes sense for both of these units to be out there, as much as it might annoy the fans.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. And the musicians themselves are very aware of this.
Yeah,
Like it would have to be a situation, well, like Journey with Steve Perry rejoining, but then
yeah,
again, it's 2025. Did the window close on that being a big deal? Did the
yeah.
window close on Sebastian Bach rejoining Skid Row? Or
Well,
would you have,
no one's going to pay more than
yep,
$60 to see
because
Journey.
I saw Sebastian Bach last year with his band
Yeah,
and he was great.
yeah,
I wouldn't pay, but I don't know that I'd pay double that
yeah,
to go see him sing the same songs with Rachel and Snake. I mean,
yeah.
knowing me, I probably would. But I mean, if you're
We're
hearing
in
the
we
songs,
would, but we're in the minority.
and actually linking this to the Purple World earlier this year, last show I saw was Adrian Vandenberg playing mostly
Right,
Whitesnake
right.
songs. It was fantastic.
Yeah,
It was an affordable way to see some great music being
yeah,
played live
yeah.
with at least one legendary musician on stage.
Glenn a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic, Glenn Hughes toured a Deep Purple show, playing the stuff he played and then the hits, and it was like one of the best gigs I've ever been to.
Yep.
Glenn Hughes still has his voice,
Yep.
and then he just is spot on with all the Purple stuff. And I was wondering if Ian Gillan retired, if they would then look to maybe Hughes to take over as the main singer, because he's still got the chops for it.
That's you can count on one hand the guys that still have the majority
Mm,
of their vocal
mm,
chops at this. That's
yeah,
that's a that's another big reason why is that why doesn't such and such have you heard such and such sing
yeah,
lately? They
yeah,
can't
yeah,
do it anymore.
yeah,
They can't hit those high notes like they
yeah.
used to hit. But what that brings back around to the Deep Purple situation in
Mm,
1980. And you already alluded to this with the state fairs and the tractor
yeah.
pulls and stuff. For the most part, this band was not playing major markets. They were
No,
playing
no.
not even secondary markets,
Yeah.
tertiary markets, third, fourth, fifth markets where people just did not get big shows. And that's
Hmm.
how they were able to, I think that's how they were able to do it as long as they did. Because I mean, this tour,
Yeah.
this stretched on for
About 6 months.
about 6 months and it just lurched from like you just didn't know. That's one of the things that I find hard to put down with the book. You're like, oh, it's got to end soon. No, they just kept going in the face of all adversity and with everything in their heads, probably telling them, you got to stop this. This is not working. But they took the bitter end
So
and
I
even
think that
really
I
bit
think
a little bit beyond.
yes, I think
Yeah.
by the end they were getting booked like a bar band,
Yeah.
rather than I mean, certainly Steppenwolf were. They were getting booked.
Yeah.
Okay, you've got a show in New York tonight, and then you've got LA tomorrow. Work it out, you know. And they would. So I think all allusions to an actual tour, a planned tour, fell out the window. I think
Yeah.
there's certainly there's a directory from 1980 that Billboard put out, and it's a directory of who manages, who is responsible for booking the acts, and there's another directory of where the acts are going to be and what spare dates they have. So you could just, oh, Deep Purple are there tomorrow night. Let's see if we can get them. We're close enough. Let's see if we can get them here tonight. And there was no real thought. It was just, okay, there's a gig there, gig there, gig there, gig there. There's no real thought to planning a tour around the States. It was just, we'll do as much as we can until the bubble bursts. It was until we get stopped. But I think there's a couple of reasons why it went on so long. One of the reasons was, and I firmly believe this, I believe the management were in a scenario of let's wait and see what happens, because no one really. It wasn't until July. They started off in April, and it wasn't until July that it first went to court. And no one in Deep Purple was interested in Deep Purple. And I think the
Yeah.
management saw it as, well, if this goes well, we can license the name and get free money. So I think the reason why they operated from a position of confidence to begin with is because they might have been given a unofficial nod to say, like the fake Fleetwood Mac were given the nod by Mick Fleetwood, allegedly, according to everyone but Mick Fleetwood.
Right. Right.
Um, um, so I think there might have been a nod to say, go ahead, with the management waiting to see what happens. And then when it started going tits up, then when it started going really, really badly, and possibly the implosion of the fake Steppenwolfs and how badly that went, where it kind of affected the management's decision to go, we know nothing about this. This is outrageous. And then it went to court. But then the first court case, the reason why it went on so long is the first court case in July, a guy called Judge Kellner, who was a former LTA. He did a lot of work for tennis pros in getting them paid in the open era. And he's done a lot of showbiz cases. He really, really understood copyright, and he understood trademarks, and he said to Deep Purple, he said basically, you haven't proven that this is damaging you. And so
Yeah.
he kicked it into the long grass. And so that was another reason why they couldn't get it they went on for so long. And of course, if you're in the fake or the new Deep Purple, you take that as a massive vote of confidence in your favor. So there's several reasons why they got away with it for so long. One of them, the slow-moving U.S. justice system. One of them, I firmly believe, it is a belief, I firmly believe the management were on board to begin with. Tony Collette, at the very least, they were sitting back to see what would happen. I'm not saying the band were, but I think the management might have been. And then, of course, the judge that came along and said, well, there's actually an argument to say a touring Deep Purple is selling records for you. Look at all of the record. Look at the three greatest hits you've had in the charts whilst they have been.
Yeah.
So I think the complexities of copyright kept it and trademark kept it going as well.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, they're looking at it from, it has nothing to do with you're damaging a classic institution of rock.
No.
No, when they're like, this band may lose us money if their marquee value keeps shrinking.
Yeah.
But if it didn't, if the opposite was true, who knows? You may have had a Deep Purple existing alongside Rainbow and Whitesnake, and then the whole time space fabric of rock history would have been altered. I mean, at one point you mentioned in the book they even had some label interest from Mike Curb, which I did not know that. And then at that time, I think Curb was distributed by Warner, so they would have been right back on their U.S. label.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so what happened though? I mean, and this is something else, just quickly about that Fleetwood Mac thing. That's fascinating to me because yes, we're not talking about the Buckingham Nicks, the Rumors era, but would no one have noticed that there's not one woman on stage? Like, where's Christine McVie? Like, they didn't even try to that I just, at least in the case of Steppenwolf, sometimes they'd have a guy try and look like John Kay, and in the case of Deep Purple, they'd have Tony Flynn sort of like pose like Blackmore. But I mean, like the beginning of the book says, and this is something I do before a show, when I see the equipment set up, I'd be like, well, that's a right-handed kit.
Yeah.
Casey's famously a southpaw drummer. Like, that's not right. And the Richie stands there, and who's even like Richie wasn't even in the band when they broke up. What's going on?
No, totally. I mean, and that's it. Their undoing was the hardcore fans. That was their undoing, and that's why they tried to avoid the big towns. But going back to Fleetwood Mac, I think that might be my next book, by the way, is about the fake Fleetwood Mac.
Cool.
I've been speaking to a few people about it. I think there's enough story there. But going back to that, I think they were relying on the fact that Mick Fleetwood probably was going to join the band at some point. according to everyone but Mick Fleetwood,
Hmm.
and also according to a lot of people who didn't have skin in the game, who had, who didn't have either way. Mick Fleetwood has, so and um, also as well, Mick Fleetwood or Fleetwood Mac had changed their lineup so often. Even
Right.
even by the 74, there was only Fleetwood
John McVie.
and John McVie from the original band.
Yeah.
So a band turning up with a drummer that you couldn't make out may
Hmm.
well have been Fleetwood Mac,
Yeah.
especially in when everyone was stoned. I mean, I remember there was I can't remember who it was, but it was a promoter who wrote a book about it, and he mentioned the fake Fleetwood Mac, and he said everyone loved it. He says, I assume everyone's too stoned to recognize who it was, or they didn't know what they looked like.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think the longest serving member by 74 had been Bob Welsh, and he was 2 years or maybe 3 years in. However, the
Yeah.
interesting thing about the Fleetwood Mac is that story indirectly gave us rumors. So what happened was Bob Weston had an affair with Mick Fleetwood's wife, which
Right.
caused Fleetwood Fleetwood Mac to say, "I can't. We have to go off the road. I need time to recuperate." Or some sources say we're breaking up.
Yeah.
Okay. The manager, Clifford David, says, "You can't do that. I'm going to lose millions. We've already cancelled a tour. I'm going to lose millions." So Clifford put a fake Fleetwood Mac on the road to save his reputation, allegedly with Mick Fleetwood's agreement, which I believe because there's court documents to say that he did definitely meet the members. However, the court case that came afterwards, and one of the reasons why Bob Welsh did all the heavy running in the court case is because I think he was least connected to the original agreement. If John McVie stood in court, he'd have had to say, "Yeah, Fleetwood told me about it." If Fleetwood stood, so Bob Welsh did all the heavy lifting of the court case in trying to rescue the name. Then Welsh, who stood around for another album, was so exhausted by all the drama that goes on with Fleetwood Mac, he had to leave. He was having a breakdown, and that led Fleetwood to then having to hire Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks. So
Yeah.
had Bob Weston not had an affair with Mick Fleetwood's wife, we never would have had rumors.
It's this
Isn't that a
crazy. It's
glorious
this.
story?
It's this crazy Rube Goldberg, Wile E. Coyote chain of
Yeah.
events that just, it's like, yeah. In the case of Fleetwood Mac, they just kind of failed upwards
Yes.
on a
Yeah.
personal level,
Yeah.
and yeah, that's really, it's fascinating. And with Deep Purple, it's just it makes you wonder. But one thing that gets me about this, like I've, there's very little footage. There's very, very little
Hmm.
footage that exists, which is a shame because that's the type of thing that diehards like us would just.
Yeah.
There's a morbid curiosity because I've heard
Hmm.
this said different times. Like if you like a band, you're interested in their high points.
Yeah.
But if you love a band, you're interested in the low
Oh
points.
yeah.
So I mean,
Yeah.
good or bad, train wreck or not, you'd want to
Yeah.
hear those
Yeah.
bootleg recordings, or imagine if there was a real good quality soundboard from Mexico City, or one of the better attended gigs.
Yeah.
But what gets me is that the band, normally most groups, the longer they're on tour, the tighter they get, the more they gel
Yeah.
together. It always sounded like they'd just learned how to play and they never rehearsed. Like it's like
I.
they learned a bit of the songs.
Yeah.
They never took the time to keep, to keep
Keep tight.
refining and
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, like the songs, they did not get tighter. Um,
No, no.
but
I think, like I said, I think they were booked as a bar band. We've got a gig tonight, and everyone came from their respective vans and towns and just
yeah,
turned up.
and in
You
some
know.
cases, they didn't even bring their own equipment. They're playing on rented equipment, right? Which
Mm,
a band like Deep Purple, and I know like some people were like that doesn't make any sense. Or there was one show that was mentioned. I can't remember if it was canceled or not. It may have been one of the many canceled ones where somebody's like, "That can't be. It can't be Deep Purple. Nobody that big ever plays here. It can't be
so,
Deep Purple."
are
So
you
by that,
talking about? Are you talking about the Baby O in New
yes,
Jersey?
yeah,
Yes,
it's
and
like that
yeah,
doesn't. And yet, even still, there are people who swear that gig happened.
yeah, yeah. Well, I don't. So that's one gig I don't believe happened. It's been written as happened previously. However, I spoke to the door bouncer, the bouncer on the door, and he said it was cancelled like an hour before it was supposed to go ahead. Now that's not to say another Deep Purple, another gig wasn't booked in that venue on a different date. And it's not to say they didn't ever play Seaside Heights, because there are about 35 gigs we can't place. There are 70 or so shows. We know where 35 of them were. So it's not to say they didn't play Seaside Heights on a different night. So someone saying I saw them in Seaside Heights at the Baby O may be telling the truth. However, they may also have seen them at another gig and confusing it and saw the poster of the Baby O. But I believe that the gig that the Baby O, as previously said, had gone ahead, actually was cancelled, certainly according to the door staff, who's, when you talk to someone, you interview someone. So I spoke to a few people with information, and a lot of them, it turned out they didn't really know what they were talking about. However, you get to find out the people who you can, just by asking certain questions, the certain detail they can add in, like little things like who was working the bar that night. And, so the door person I spoke to, whose name I can't remember, basically was convinced the gig didn't happen. And I think that one, he's correct, because because of the way, the detail he goes into about it not happening. Now, that's not to say it didn't happen on a different night that he wasn't
Right.
working.
It didn't happen on that. It didn't
Yeah,
happen on the
didn't happen on the
original.
advertised night that we know
Right.
of.
Yeah. So just see it. I didn't understand why it's like, well, if you're really trying to make a go at this, why wouldn't you work a little harder at presenting the songs? You know, I mean, it's not like they couldn't, obviously they were proficient musicians, but it just
Yeah.
sounded like every gig, the way that it was described, how they were playing is like the first
Mm.
time these five guys had ever played together, all the way to the end of the shows. So it's like, why wouldn't you be getting a little bit better as it's going?
I think it started off as a legitimate attempt at putting on good shows. And I think the earlier shows were probably better than the later shows, because by the time, say, July rolls around, no, maybe not July, but maybe August, and let's say that they kind of realize how deep they're in it. I think by that point, I think when the LA gig didn't go well in August, the famous gig where
Oh,
the Deep Purple management put the advert in the paper that says none of the following
right.
Deep Purple, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think when that finally went, I think then they thought, okay, let's try and make as much money as we can before we're shut down.
Yeah.
I didn't ever think I don't think they ever thought they'd lose as much money as they did in the court case. And I think they thought, right, we're on cash grabs here. So it was a case of, how do we cut the costs? Well, we hire a support band who use the similar instruments to what we do. Okay, that way we don't need to transport our instruments. That means if we go into Canada, we can go in as tourist visas. We don't have to
Yeah.
pay performing visas.
Yeah.
So things like that. I think the evidence is all there to say by the time August came along, they realized the jig was up. And so they were just trying to get as much as they can whilst the gravy train was slowly. So they were turning up. They were playing. They weren't invested. They didn't care. They were playing drunk, and there aren't many reports of very good gigs after the calamity at the Long Beach Arena.
A certain amount of cynicism seems to have set in.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, as you open, like, I like how you open the show, because I can picture the gig. It was one of the
yeah.
gigs in Quebec, and it sounds like a nightmare unfolding,
Mm-hmm.
because, lots of technical problems, but yet every time there was a technical problem, the band would leave the stage, and then they'd come back and there'd be more technical problems. They'd leave the stage again. But the absolute defiance on part of the band, like the way that you describe Rod Evans, like all smiling almost maniacally,
Yeah,
it's like that's unsettling.
yeah.
And telling the crowd off, and it's it just it's fascinating. It's fascinating. It's like, I cannot believe that it went on as long as it did, because we are talking 1980. We're kind of in a modern era, more or
Mm-hmm.
less, and you would think that it just, but the long arm of the law moves slow sometimes.
Yeah,
It's not instant today where you post something and you get a copyright
yeah.
strike or something like that. But yeah, and playing these backwater places where it's not fair to assume that these backwater places or these lesser populous towns and cities, you
Oh,
don't have passionate rock fans that know everybody that's ever been in the band and
no.
more or less what they look like, and go, that's okay, that's Rod Evans, yes,
Yeah.
but I no idea who the rest of these jokers are. Like it's just very weird. And the thing is, like Rod Evans was the vocalist in Deep Purple in its earliest incarnation, but that's not what Deep Purple as a whole were known for. That's not the
So
sound they were
I
known
th-
for.
I think this is a point I've made before. I think for me, he had a legal right to a portion of the name,
Yep.
but he had absolutely no right to the brand,
Hmm.
if that makes sense, because the band that he fronted were a psychedelic mod rock band.
Yeah.
And the band that Deep Purple became were a hard rock behemoth. And
Yeah.
he had no right to that version. And if
Yeah.
he'd have gone out, go on, sorry.
No, I was gonna say he had, like the idea of him going out there and singing "Burn"
Yeah,
or
yeah,
or or, or
yeah.
"Stormbringer" or even "Smoke on the Water." Rod Evans was a crooner. I
Yes,
listen,
well,
I
this is
listen,
it. This,
I
yeah,
listened to some of that early stuff. He's got a little Elvis in him, like like Neil. He very convincingly covers Neil Diamond because he's not that different a singer. It's
yeah,
not a hard rock voice. It's a good
no,
voice, but
yeah,
it's not a hard rock voice at all. He doesn't have the wild screams of Ian Gillan
no,
or
no,
even, the belting of David Coverdale or the
yeah,
high voice of Glenn Hughes. He's got none
yeah,
of that. He's just like so for him to go out and it's so funny when they talk about how they couldn't even on Sunday they couldn't even play Hush right. It's like
yeah.
that's your ace in the hole, pal. If you can't nail that song, you know.
I
Uh,
mean, I think also as well, there was what you're dealing with was a Rod Evans who'd had 5 years of retirement.
yeah,
So I think them not getting Hush right, and anytime Rod, because I mean, Rod was a very good singer.
yeah.
And now the footage of Smoke on the Water in Mexico doesn't do them justice. There's a couple of reasons why it doesn't do them justice. One, it's recorded on a sound boom for a
Hmm.
television camera. They didn't have the soundboard mic'd up. They were on a sound boom.
Yeah.
Um, but the other reason is, according to Tony Flynn, it was so hot that the generator was running slow, and the generator powered the organ was running slow. And it wasn't like today. If the organ's not getting enough power, it's not playing in the right key because it's analog.
Right.
So everyone else had to down tune to the organ. And Rod Evans, who's a singer, 5 years out of practice, had rehearsed, say, in G, and they're all now playing in A or whatever. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Rod Evans is
His
having
muscle
to,
memory is going to sing in the key he's used
yes,
to, and all of a
that
sudden
is.
now he's out of key with the rest of the band.
So someone's done a remastered clip of that footage where they have tried to use AI to correct the
The
sound, and it
pitch correct.
does,
Yeah.
yes, and it does sound better. Doesn't sound great, but it does sound better, and it gives you some clue as to how they could have been had they rehearsed. And
Hmm.
it's not that bad. I've certainly heard bootlegs of the Coverdale Hughes bowling lineup that were worse.
Yeah.
No, sorry, the Black Ball. I don't think I've heard many Coverdale Hughes bowling live. I've certainly heard, no, yes, sorry, yes, Mark IV. I'm getting confused. I've certainly heard live recordings of Mark IV that sounded worse than that. But as you say, we want to hear everything.
Yeah.
There is a recording. Apparently, Celebrity Theatre did a video. There's talk about the Celebrity Theatre owner video, but I tried to get in touch with them, and no one would answer me. And then I was talking to some guys who they did a recording in Anchorage. They played this wonderfully strange. They played 2 nights in the International Banqueting Hotel
Yeah.
in Anchorage, and a couple of guys did a sound recording of it. But then they recorded it over the tapes to record their own demos. And I'm just like, oh,
That's the thing about tape medium. Sometimes stuff is just gone,
yeah. And
you
it's a
know?
real shame. It's a
Yeah.
real shame.
Like
I
I
hope,
don't think people think at that time, you don't think of that, 40 years from now, people might have
yeah,
any interest in it. It's like when they would kick people out for bootlegging concerts. Now, when they put box sets and documentaries together, they're looking for those people. What have you
yeah,
got?
yeah.
Do you
Well,
have
thank God. I
anything
mean,
from this show? Right?
yeah, thank God people bootlegged the Velvet Underground
Yeah.
and early Aerosmith, or we wouldn't have known what they really sounded like live.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, but I think generally these days people are like, okay, that's all right, you can do it. It's seen as a necessary evil.
Well, technology has gotten to the point where you could do it so
Yeah.
quietly, and you don't have to lug a bunch of equipment in either.
Mm.
Um, Yeah, this story just has so many, and basically it seems to me like legally there's a lot of legal stuff in there, so it spells it
Yeah,
all out if you
yeah,
understand the legal jargon. But
yeah.
Rod Evans basically shot himself in the foot in the end because he went from getting a percentage of Deep Purple with
Hmm.
his time in the band to nothing.
He was earning, so he's earning probably what I would call house buying money every year.
Yeah,
Not millions and millions, but a lot for, I think he was maybe close to $70,000 a
he could
year.
live comfortably.
And also because he was also had other, I mean, he could have taken that, he could have just gone on the road as Rod Evans of formerly of Deep Purple, playing Hush, playing
Yeah.
the mod stuff, and playing to 500-600 people a night, and he'd had a very good living.
And people still
um
probably would have gone to see it because, like we've said, this would have been, well, this is the closest we're going to get to Deep Purple
yeah,
because Whitesnake isn't coming to our town, Rainbow isn't
no,
coming to our town,
yeah.
Gillan's not coming. Let's go see the original singer.
Yeah, it's a real shame. I think so. I think what happened was, they so with the court case, they ran afoul of a guy called Judge Manuel Real, who was a hero to some and a villain to many. He was a judge who had done a lot of work in early desegregating schools. So a lot of people saw him as a social justice warrior for the time. But then he was not very good at seeing nuances. He was referred to as a tyrant by a barrister, by a lawyer arguing in front of him, and he was not very good at seeing grey areas. So he had no real care for copyright and what the Deep Purple and Evans and Coletta, the management, did was very, very clever. They went out and they found witnesses who could stand in front of Judge Real and Judge Real or Judge Real, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, and say they were asked, was this what you were expecting when you bought your ticket? And every single one of them went, no, this was not what I expecting. And the Judge Real was able to see real Americans, real people getting swindled out of their hard-earned money. And to him, that he didn't need to look any further.
Now
He
there
knew
now
who
there
the
was a villain.
Now he knew who the villains were.
Yeah.
And so the nuances of copyright didn't mean anything to him. So the Deep Purple, the Rod Evans and his boys got hit with what was called punitive fine. I can't remember the exact legal phrase of it, but basically it was $800,000, which is about 4.5 million now. They made a lot of money, but they didn't make that much money
Right.
in that time,
And they weren't
and
going to.
and they weren't ever going to. I think the record company backed out when the record company, Warner's Curb, realized how hard it would be to put out an album called The New Deep Purple featuring Rod Evans. And if you put it out as a Rod Evans solo album, no one's interested in that.
Right.
So the $800,000 were to cover, so it's 600,000 in, and then 650,000, then 150,000 in charges and other smaller fines. So, but it was basically not just to punish Rod and fine him for what he did, but to be so big as to make sure that no one did it again.
To make an example.
To make an example, exemplary damages. There we go. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Exemplary damages is the legal term, and it's to make sure no one comes along and goes, well, that's all they lost. I'll make more money, so I can do it as well. So I think there's the story that he lost his rights. I don't know if he lost his rights or if he signed over his rights willfully in lieu, or the other option would be, because I don't think you can take rights away from someone legally. So
right.
Either he signed them over in a settlement, or the other option would be the monies from the rights are arrested at source. And because the legal debt is so high, the interest on the legal debt is rising higher than the royalties that he earns. Now, I've said this before, and in my head, and maybe it's just because I want to think good of them, in my head, because of some of the things the band have said, I believe the band might be, for want of a better term, looking after Rod. He might be getting something unofficially because of the statements. I mean, John Lord said things like, we could have been nicer about the whole Rod thing, and the only way to stop Rod was to sue him, implying that they didn't really want to sue him. They just wanted it to stop.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if I wonder if they basically came to this agreement, say, sign over your royalties, we're in charge of your money, but you will get something. Because I don't like to think of the guys whose music I love being,
That that
maybe that's me
heartless.
projecting. Yeah,
Yeah,
maybe I'm
yeah,
projecting. Because
yeah.
I mean, Rod was well aware. People think Rod was duped. I don't think he was duped. I think he started off on something that he believed was a good idea, and then it got away from him. I think it's an insult to Rod's intelligence to say he was duped into it. I think he thought that it was a good idea and he could and it would work at first, and then when the dust settled, he's left holding the baby.
So famously, someone that was not involved in this version of Deep Purple was
Hmm.
who, as far as we know, wasn't up to much, was the original bass player Nick Simper. Now, how much, like you've said this, you'd think it might have made a difference, a little bit of difference, if you'd had two original members of Deep Purple in there. Um,
Well,
and yet we look ahead when Deep Purple finally got into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They inducted Rod as a member, but they ignored Nick Simper, who had nothing to do with the 1980 incident. Um, that whole thing is weird to me. It's like, he wasn't doing anything to tarnish your
hmm.
legacy, willingly or otherwise. He wanted nothing to do with it. But do you think it might, Rod might have had more of a legal leg to stand on if Nick had been there and you'd had 2/5 of the original lineup?
I think certainly. First of all, Nick Simper not being invited to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is an absolute goddamn travesty.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
it didn't make any sense.
it's an outrage, and
Yeah,
it either means they've forgotten him, which is disgusting, or they didn't want him, which is worse. And
yeah,
it's like this is the guy who, according to him, and I believe him, showed Richie Blackmore the riff to Black Knight
Black
because
Knight.
it was a Ricky Nelson tune. And
Yeah,
it's like that's what the whole of modern Deep Purple's based on.
it's there. It is. It
That
starts
you know
right
what I mean?
there.
That's the
Yeah,
pivot.
yeah.
So I think that at least I think that's a bit of a travesty. But yeah, I think had he been able to persuade, um, maybe Glenn Hughes, or you know what I mean. I think had he been
Right.
able to persuade another, he would have had a better legal standing. Because I mean, certainly according to, and I don't know how much of this is true or if it was just because. But what we've got to bear in mind is as well, this whole is based on stories given to the press, which we know are now unreliable when it comes to biographies and things like that.
Yeah.
We know that um, we know that Mama Cass didn't choke on a ham sandwich. We
Right.
know the real stories now.
But
So
yet you go out on the street and you ask 10 people, how did Mama Cass die? Oh, I think she choked on a
yes,
sandwich.
yes,
So
exactly.
the damage is
So
done, right?
yes. So I just so back to your point. I wonder. Coletta said that the rule with Deep Purple has always been the last three members get to continue if they want. Now I think that was just him talking. Okay,
Yeah.
I think that was just him trying to justify his plans to turn Whitesnake into Deep Purple before they hit that 1983-84 peak of
Yeah.
Whitesnake. I think that was
Yeah.
his plan. So he's trying to sow in the seeds for that. But if that's true, then certainly, and there's a document to say that, then certainly a version of Deep Purple with two original members, both of whom were founding members and agreed to the name Deep Purple, both of whom played on what was arguably their biggest hit.
Hmm.
I think it was the one that rose highest. I think Smoke on the Water rose high as well. But I think if you pointed to Deep Purple's biggest chart placing was Hush.
Yeah.
I think you would be able to say, well, these guys have a right to this.
Yeah.
And look, here's their name on the original document. So and it's not their fault they were sacked. And look at the awful way they were sacked. They
Well,
did
yeah,
not truthfully.
that was slimy and
Yeah,
backhanded and behind their backs kind of thing. Oh, we're
yeah,
not touring, but they've got Gillan and Glover, and
yeah.
they're
So
and
that
as a matter of fact, did I read like when they went to do what ended up being Concerto for Group and Orchestra, the posters advertising them were the original five guys.
So do you know the story of how Simper found out? I think I touched on it in the Nick Simper found out. He
Yeah.
was told, "Don't come to the recording studio tonight, where the studio's broke or they're having trouble with the 4-track." Or and basically this went on for about 3 or 4 nights. And in the end, Nick Simper, whose mates tipped him off, he might be getting sacked, phoned up the record label, Tetragrammaton, I think it's
Hmm.
pronounced,
Yeah.
which was run by Bill Cosby. He phoned up the record label and he said, "When do you want the new single?" And the record label said, "We've got the new single. You're not
Hmm.
on it." And that is
Yeah.
how he found out he was sacked. So certainly armed with that, and armed with the fact there was two of them, and armed with the fact that they had a say in the name in the formation, because they made the switch from Roundabout to Deep Purple
Yeah.
altogether. So armed with all that, they would have had at the very least a better legal case than just Rod Evans. And I tell you what, I think hurt them as well was the fake Steppenwolf, because if there's one thing that Judge Manuel Real hated, was a repeat offender. And in the Deep Purple defense was able to present Tony Flynn and Jeff Emery as opportunists who went round taking over old band names and ruining them. And so
Yeah.
it was that hurt them as well. So maybe had they not had Tony Flynn and Jeff Emery in the band, and I believe it was probably partly Jeff Emery's idea, but had they not had them in the band, then I think that I had a stronger legal case as well. It's a cauldron of what ifs and maybes, but
Yeah.
you can certainly see the pattern.
Yeah, and it leads to something, it's an earlier example of something that goes on today. The name, the brand is
Yeah,
everything.
yeah,
That's why, that's why David Gilmour and Roger Waters have been like this for
yeah, yeah,
decades. The name, people identify with a name more than they do with any one or two people,
yeah,
unless you happen to be a solo
yeah,
superstar.
yeah,
And I mean, even David Coverdale, I mean, he's got more value with the name Whitesnake
yeah,
than
yeah.
under
Oh
his
yeah,
own
I'd go to a
name.
White Snake show. I'd go to a White Snake show. I probably wouldn't go to a David Coverdale show.
Yeah, it's
You know?
it could be the exact same band on stage, but
Yeah,
you present it. I mean, I saw the one time I saw Whitesnake was about 7 years ago. And I mean, obviously Coverdale was by far, by a matter of decades, the
yeah,
only original member, but didn't matter because it was David Coverdale.
yeah,
He's
yeah.
singing the
I
Whitesnake
mean,
songs, right? I mean, it was shaky, but he's David Coverdale, the rock star. He's doing the mic stand tricks. It's David Coverdale, right?
there's a British indie band called The Fall. I don't know if you've ever heard of The
I've heard
Fall,
of
and they
them.
and they I mean, then I would say they're not for a hard rock crowd. And they had a singer called Mark E. Smith, and then about 60 or so members through the ranks. And he used to say, "If it's me, you, and your mum on bongos, that counts as The Fall, as long as it's me." And
Yeah.
that's the some bands that you can say, there's some bands where there's an integral member, and there's some bands where there isn't. And certainly David Coverdale is absolutely. Whereas Deep Purple, I feel, probably could replace Glover. They could probably maybe replace Pace, maybe Gillan if Glover and Pace are still there. You know what I mean? I think they probably could still get away with one of those core three going.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people were surprised that they did, they did so well out there on the road with no
Mm,
Blackmore. Never, like,
yeah,
with not just Tommy Bolin, but with Steve Morris. I mean, they had a
yeah,
long
yeah,
career with him, and now they've got, like I remember talking with a buddy of mine when after Simon McBride joined. I'm like, it's
yeah,
weird to me to think that there's a guy in Deep Purple younger than me.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But
It
it's
could have been
great.
you. It could
Yeah,
have been you.
but it's great. I mean, that equals one album is fantastic, I think. But
Yeah, yeah,
but this is such a fascinating chapter. I mean, the Deep Purple
yeah.
story is one of constant lineup changes, and this is just right in the middle of, like, directly in the middle. So they broke up in '76. Perfect Strangers comes out in '84. Right in the middle of that, we've got
So, I mean,
this.
the reason what I say to the fans is because what I don't want to do is look. The book is maybe I've said this before again. The book is maybe it started off as an investigation, and I think it ended up as a plea for clemency. But what I don't want any hardcore fans to do, because I'm a Deep Purple fan, but
Yeah.
only quite casual. What I don't want hardcore fans to do is think I'm trying to tear down the thing they love. What I want to reiterate is this is a great story. And the reason why it's a great story is because Deep Purple are a great band. And had Deep Purple not been a great, no one's caring about this story if it's REO Speedwagon. Sorry, but they're not.
Yeah, yeah, I know
No
what you
one's
mean.
caring about,
Yeah.
and I know there are people who love REO Speedwagon, but everyone in the world can tell you a Deep Purple song. And the reason why it's a great story is because Deep Purple are a great band. And that's what I want to hammer home to any fans who might be watching this thing. And why are you trying to shed a light on this chapter? It's like, because embrace it. It's another story that makes Deep Purple the legend that they are.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's a great sidebar story to what
Yes.
might have
Yes.
been,
Yes.
because weird things happen in the music biz. I mean,
Had it gone well?
who would have thought, like Whitesnake, Whitesnake starting off under really weird circumstances, like David Coverdale does those two solo albums, then an EP that,
Yeah.
his solo album, the first one's called White Snake,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that sort of morphs in, like, is Snakebite the first White Snake out? Is Trouble? Which is
Hmm.
it? And there's, who's in the band? Okay, it's not David Dowell, it's Ian Pace, it's not
Yeah.
Mickey, now it's John Sykes, and now it's Adrian
Yeah.
Vandenberg. But less than 10 years, they put out X amount of albums. They're one of the biggest bands in the world. Who would have saw that coming?
Yeah.
With
Yeah.
with a singer with a completely different lineup.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, who's to say that these guys, if they'd have, if they'd have worked really hard and played really hard and practiced and sound checked and used their own equipment, right?
Yeah.
Used
Yeah.
their so there was a uniform sound at
Hmm.
every show they played, built up that goodwill, built up that reputation,
Yeah.
wrote some really good songs.
Yeah.
It could have been nobody, and Warner Brothers would have been so happy, and Coletta Edwards would have been so happy. No, there have been none of this negativity. So who knows how this might have turned? And that's probably what kept this going as long as it did. Maybe the
So
next gig will be the one.
so a lot of people are sitting back and waiting to. So I mean, what we say about Fleetwood Mac had. So I've got this theory. The Velvet Underground album "Squeeze" just by Doug Yule.
Yeah,
It's just got
I
Doug.
wasn't familiar with that band other than I knew Lou Reed was in them. So
Right.
I read that part. I actually didn't know they continued after
So
him.
they carried on, and
Yeah.
had Squeeze been successful, that's the Velvet Underground we'd know now.
Yeah.
In the same way we know Fleetwood Mac for rumors, and very few people are out there. I mean, it's the Fleetwood Mac before Fleetwood Mac, the Peter Green Fleetwood Mac. So, and like with Starship, who
Yes.
evolved out of Jefferson
Yes.
Airplane, they were
Yes.
huge in the 80s. And
Yep.
you're absolutely right. Who's to say that had they had a different turn, maybe they didn't have the same guys in the band, maybe they had different guys, maybe they had Simper, maybe they worked on the rehearsing before, maybe they rehearsed for a year before they launched, and maybe they went from the ground up rather than trying to play, and maybe they went out with the name definitely every single time, the new Deep Purple, or Deep Purple Today, or Deep Purple Feature. Who's to say that they couldn't have done, and then gone out and played their own songs, and the ones Rod had previously sung on, and maybe as an encore they drop in Smoke, or they drop in, but they don't go and base themselves on that band. Then yeah, they could have been the Deep Purple we listen to today, because Deep Purple were not interested in being the Deep Purple we listen to today in 1980.
But
They couldn't. Yeah.
do you think maybe, like you said, with Bob Weston having an affair with Mick Fleetwood's wife, if that hadn't kicked off that weird chain of events, if this hadn't happened, do you think maybe we might never have gotten Perfect Strangers? Do you think
I think.
maybe Ian Gillan would still be in Black Sabbath, and and Rainbow would have, because Joe Lynn Turner has said many times he always thought that with Rainbow they were one album away from really breaking into that Journey, Foreigner,
Mm-hmm.
AOR league, because they were doing better and better, but they never had a gold record. But we'll never know, because hey, guess what? Here's Mark II back together again in a
So
very short amount of time. Like in early '84, Rainbow's playing in Japan, right? So
yeah, As Joe Lynn Turner was their third singer, wasn't he? After Dio and what's his name?
Graham Bonnet. Yeah, he
Graham
sang
Bonnet.
on Difficult to Cure, Straight Between the Eyes, and Bend in the
Yeah.
Shape. That, and
So
then they went on hiatus.
so they had a hit over here. They had two hits over here. For with Graham Bonnet. They had
Well, it's Since You've Been Gone and All Night Long.
yes. So yeah, and I guess you have to look at the different lineups of Rainbow as different bands, I think.
Oh, especially if you go from Dio to Joe
Yeah,
Lynn Turner. I mean,
yeah,
that's the Graham Bonnet stuff was pointing in that more commercial direction.
yeah.
But by the time you get Joe Lynn Turner, that's very AOR. I call it a heavier Foreigner because
Yes, yeah.
Joe Lynn kind of reminds me of, like, he's got a Lou Graham quality to his voice.
He's got a very
And then the even funnier thing is that here comes in 1990. Guess what? Slaves and Masters has that's Deep Rainbow, right? You've got three
it's
fifths of the famous Rainbow lineup. It's so strange. It's so convoluted, that purple family tree, and this just adds more branches onto that family tree.
I think so. So I think, to answer your initial question, I think it sped up the reunion.
Yeah,
So having the five of them of Mark II working on this together, and I don't know why Blackmore was involved, because Blackmore had washed his hands of Deep Purple a year before they even broke up.
right.
But I guess they're all now thinking. I think a couple of things happened, but I think when what happened, when it became apparent how bad the Steppenwolf name had got, I think it made everyone go, "Oh shit, those
Yeah,
guys are now in Deep Purple." I think that's what happened, and then I think what happened was that defrosted
yeah,
the frosty tensions
yeah,
between the guys. And okay, it didn't happen straight away, but it was the first step. And I think that first step was a few years away. However, the constant Deep Purple reunion rumors did did them no favors when it came to Rod Evans' new Deep Purple, because there was always talk about, oh, I think Deep Purple are getting back together, and then a month later there'd be an advert in town for the Deep Purple, and so people would put the rumors together with the advert in their head, and that sold the tickets. You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah,
I think the
yeah.
constant bickering and speculation did no favors to Deep Purple to get rid of the bogus Deep Purple, because it made people believe it was real. But yeah, I certainly think it was the first step on the road to reunion. I don't, however, think that Gillan would have stayed in Black Sabbath.
No, I don't. I think that was a very strange chapter in that
Yeah,
band's history. But
yeah,
another thing is that, they still, at this point, even though, I mean, I'm a huge Whitesnake fan of all those lineups. I really like the Rainbow stuff.
yeah,
It wasn't selling. Whitesnake did well in the UK, but
yeah.
and so did Rainbow, but there were no gold records in the States. Deep Purple had but if Rainbow had been really big, and if
Mm,
Whitesnake had been big straight away in North
yeah,
America,
yeah, yeah. I
would there
don't
have
think
been
that.
as much enticement to
I don't think it would have
uproot?
happened.
Yeah. I
Yeah, I
mean,
don't.
chances are you'd have still had a Whitesnake, because Coverdale would not have been involved. You'd still have a
Yeah,
Whitesnake lineup of some sort, but you wouldn't have had Deep Purple. You certainly wouldn't have had those five guys coming
no.
back together. And also, I think they realized by 1984, like anybody that was a teenager or just a little bit older, that in 72 when Machine Head was big, well, now they're out working and they've got money to go see a reunion show.
Yeah, yeah.
So I
Oh,
think
well,
that factored in.
that's why the new Deep Purple was able to sell tickets,
Yeah,
because the bands, when I talk about them being a great band, I mean it. We forget how important they remained between 1976 and 1980 to teenagers, predominantly teenage boys, who were still getting into Led Zeppelin, still getting into Black Sabbath, still getting into Deep Purple. They were the big three. And so to suddenly have these kids who were 12, 13 when Deep Purple broke up in Liverpool. I think they broke up in Liverpool, didn't they, in 1976?
I think so. Yeah, the very
Yeah, the
shambolic
very
gig. Yeah,
yeah, to have these kids who were 12, 13 then, suddenly now being 17, 18, with working in gas stations and working in
little
stores,
disposable income.
little bit of money, they could
Yeah,
suddenly go and see the band that they were told they were never ever going to get to see. So I think
yeah.
circumstance, I think that was their audience as well. I think it was people who wanted it and people who never had it.
Well, so
You know?
1980 too. I mean, they
Yeah,
popped this out. This went to
Yeah.
#1 in the
Oh,
UK,
I know. Well, yes.
and
It's a great record.
it's a great
Um,
compilation. But
yeah.
tellingly, there's no Mark One stuff on here.
Well, so there were five between 1976 and 1980. There were 5 or 6 Deep Purple compilations released.
Well, they put out
Uh,
20. There was 24 Karat Purple came out in 75.
yeah,
I'm thinking in North America, and then in 78 they put out one called "When We Rock, We Rock," and "When We Roll, We Roll" had like the spaceship
yeah,
cover on it. And I always think I always talk about compilations. There's got to be a strategic reason for it.
yeah.
Why'd they put out 24 Karat Purple when they did? Well, I know "Come Taste the Band" came out that same year, but so did the first Rainbow album.
Right,
So,
right.
and
Yeah,
what happened in 1978? Here comes Whitesnake. So they
yeah,
put this
yeah,
compilation out. What happened in 1980? Oh, someone else is purporting to be Deep Purple. We'll put out
yeah,
a 12-song album full of songs everybody knows that has nothing to do with the singer that's
yeah,
out there on the road
yeah.
calling himself Deep Purple.
Well,
And there
that's quite
probably were
interesting.
other international ones because I mean they're a band that's their
Yeah. So
catalog's top heavy with live albums and comps.
there was a compilation called Mark One and Two Singles. There was another compilation whose name I can't remember, but it went out in a really strange small label. And then there was various ones in Germany and Europe as well.
Yeah.
I remember looking through the discography and finding five or six compilations between 76 and 80 and just thinking, oh, okay, you were still a going
And they
concern.
don't and record companies don't bother with those unless there's a market.
Yeah, and they were still hitting the charts. This
Yep.
compilation was still hitting the charts, and the singles were still hitting airplay charts.
Yep.
I think a live version of "Smoke" got released as well, and that charted as well. So I think, I mean, they were still. We forget this. We forget how big they were, and we
Yeah.
forget that how much people really, really wanted that reunion. So when a fake Deep Purple turned up, it's not surprising that 1,500 to 6,000 people went along and went, "This is for me."
Yeah.
You know,
This might be the next best thing.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So, folks, if you're interested, believe me, you want this book, "Stealing Deep Purple" by Steve McLean. Now, where's the preferred spot where people can get a hold of this? Because I know I ordered it from the link you sent me, and I had it in a few
yeah.
days. It was
So
fast.
I have got a website called deeppurplebook.com. And on that website, there's a link to the book that I sent you, but also on there, there's lots of support materials. So things that basically, when I find photos and stuff, I couldn't afford to put the photos in the book. So I've got a long form interview on there with a guy called Mitch Shakur, who is Joe Cocker's keyboard player. I spoke to him to get information on some venues. I'll be putting up an interview with Charlie Farron, who was Joe Perry's
Joe
singer.
Perry, yeah.
He let me in on a lot of he was playing the same venues around Boston, so he let me in on he gave me a great long form interview on his life of Joe Perry. Then I'm going to have biographies of the various members on there. Currently, there's 4 or 5 blogs link with about Fleetwood Mac and the New Cactus Band and the Velvet Underground and the Byrds, and so other bands it's happened to. So bands that have gone out with the new in front of them. So because I want to basically show people what the entertainment industry was like and why I believe everyone was in on it, because it happened so often. To believe that venues didn't know who they were booking would have to be incredibly naive.
Yeah.
When there were so many the new versions of bands, and there was the Billboard press telling you who was in the bands and who you could book them through, and you know what I mean. And
Yeah.
so I just
Yeah.
believe it was one of those plausible deniability situations.
Oh, yeah, it was to save face.
Yeah. So deeppurplebook.com, there's going to be a lot of support content. There's 7 or 8 blogs up there at the moment, including a lovely little, I found stuff not relevant to the book, but the drummer Dick Jurgens. Dick Jurgens the third, his dad was a big band drummer like Glenn Miller, and he had the Dick Jurgens Orchestra, and he was famous enough that Dick Jurgens the third birth was announced in the local society pages. You know what I mean? So I found a clipping of him, Dick Jurgens' announcement in the local society pages being born. So just little tidbits like that of here's what the band were and here's what's going on around it. So yeah, deeppurplebook.com, and you'll be able to order it there.
All right, great. I'll have a link posted to that below.
Thank you very much.
So Steve, like I said, I'm glad, much like the books that I've done, It was a book that I myself would want to read, so I wrote it, and that sounds like that's what you did here. I was hoping somebody
Yeah.
would do the best they could with all of this conflicting information and
Yeah. Oh,
compress it into a usable book. Go ahead.
can I say one more thing? Listen, if there's anyone out there who knows more than me, get in touch. I'm going to revise. I've had a lot of people get in touch, and no one's really contradicted me yet. But they have given me more information, and there's going to be an updated version in about 18 months' time. And ideally, I want you to read the book and tell me, actually, it happened like this, because I want this book to get people out of the woodwork and bring more to the story. At the moment, I think we've got the best possible version of the story, but that's not to say it can't get better.
It's rock and roll history, and this stuff deserves to be preserved as best as
Yeah,
possible. And this is a
yeah,
story that, the powers that be in the official Deep Purple entity would rather have you forget. But I think it's important to it
yeah.
happened. It
Yeah.
actually happened. This was not myth, it's not mythical.
And
There
it adds to their mythos.
it
It adds to them being
definitely.
a great band. Because if
Well,
we don't.
you're absolutely right. If nobody cared about Deep Purple and if their music wasn't so influential, then nobody would try to steal them.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that is it. That's what I've. You know what? I've been trying to say that for about 6 months, and you've done it in one sentence.
If it wasn't worth anything, it wouldn't be worth stealing.
Yes,
So
exactly, exactly.
so Stealing Deep Purple, Steve McLean, great read. Check it out. It's an easy read. It's a quick read. If you're like me, you won't be able to put it down until it's finished, and then you'll open it up again.
Thank you very
So
much.
yes. So thanks everybody for watching this. Comment below. Was anybody watching this at any of those shows? And yeah, great read. So Stealing Deep Purple, Steve McLean. Check it out. I want to thank everybody for watching this edition of Tim's Vinyl Confessions. We'll talk to you later.